Times were very dark in the 80s because we didn't have information. This is actually a time of light because we have so much information. I'm not crazy for being concerned about DDT, or I'm not crazy because my kids are acting out when they get foods with red dye number 40. We are dumbing down our population. Gender identity comes from the brain.
Interesting. So you believe that if a 6 or 7 year old child is born a girl but thinks that she's a boy, that she should have a sex change?
Is this the way your child identifies, or is this an episode where they're just expressing themselves? Studies have found now that boys with the highest amounts of nanoplastics in their bodies also have low amounts of testosterone.
Let's talk about where those nanoplastics come from.
That's one of the myths I've busted, and I want to bust it completely.
On today's episode, I'm joined by David Steinman, an environmentalist, journalist, consumer health advocate, publisher, and author. He's published 5 books focusing largely on environmental, dietary, and consumer safety issues, including Diet for a Poisoned Planet in 1990. He's a founder of the publishing company Freedom Press, Healthy Living magazine, and he also operates an online radio show entitled Green Patriot Radio. Enjoy this episode with David Steinman, and come back next week for another conversation with an amazing guest. David, you have published 5 books, the first one being Diet for a Poisoned Planet back in 1990. So you have been in this health game for a while.
I have, and I think it's given me a perspective to see how much progress the anti-toxic / environmental movement has made. I think it's really important for folks to have a perspective because things can seem awfully bleak at times, with the news about the Supreme Court taking away the right of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate chemicals and emissions, which recently happened. And when I began this back literally in the 80s, it was dark then too. Ronald Reagan was president. And, Jessica, he was not into global warming. He didn't get it at all. So we wasted a lot of time between Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush in terms of dealing with that crisis. But times were very dark then, and our movement is really young. I began my work in the 80s, but our movement really didn't begin until the 60s. It didn't even have a birth until Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring and published it in 1962. And, before then, we didn't even have a vocabulary to talk about things like parts per billion or endocrine disruption or reproductive harm. None of the population, none of us understood that. No one did. I mean, it was left to a very few scientists. There was no internet. So it was very dark. And we passed a law in California called the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act in 1986. And I was a journalist then, and I was covering the event, but I was also really happy that it passed. It was led by Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda. And it was really the public's rebuke of a government that didn't seem interested in taking care of our health and protecting us, because it required all companies, in California at least, to label their products for cancer-causing chemicals or those that cause reproductive harm if they were found at certain amounts thought to be harmful, and it allowed citizens to enforce the law. It was a really bright light in an otherwise dark time. And I feel like in many ways, with that perspective, we're in a dark time now, politically and environmentally. And I don't want people to give up, throw up their hands and just say, there's nothing we can do. There's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we have done.
You've mentioned the term dark several times. Can you elaborate what you mean by dark? And do you see the world as being that way since you've been looking into health more thoroughly?
Well, the anti-toxic movement is one of hope and empowerment. It really puts it doesn't blame victims, but it lets us people know that we have the power to change things, and we are. When I say dark, you know, when I wrote, as I was writing Raising Healthy Kids, Protecting Your Children from Hidden Chemical Toxins, my latest book, I went all across the United States. And whereas in the 1980s, um, industry was able to isolate victims. In other words, if something was happening in a town in New York or Florida, the folks in North Carolina wouldn't necessarily know about it. People didn't talk. If a woman got cancer like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and she had used dark hair dyes all her life, she didn't know that the hair dyes caused that because she didn't have other victims to talk to. So literally the times were dark in the 80s. And that's why I say it. There was darkness. It was, I was poisoned by DDT in of growing up fishing in the Santa Monica Bay of California. I ate all that fish, and I didn't know until I was an investigative journalist and did the story that a company manufacturing DDT had dumped 2,000 tons where I fished in the Santa Monica Bay. So I was an early victim. But Jessica, I would not have known that if I hadn't done a study. I was with the LA Weekly, then a newspaper in California, and after some dolphins washed ashore, they had died from toxic exposures. They had just a lot of DDT and PCBs in their blubber. I organized a study wherein we looked at the blood serum levels of DDT and PCBs of men and women who were also eating fish from the bay, Santa Monica Bay. And we found very high levels in these folks. I happened to have my own blood measured because I was curious, and I had high levels too. And that's when I put together, oh, I'm getting poisoned too by the fish I'm eating. I better change my way of life. I never would have known that, Jessica, if it hadn't been for that dolphin that washed ashore, an editor who told me this is the story we want to do at the LA Weekly. And then I went out and did it and discovered this. This would have been kept secret. There was no internet. So in a sense, I was the first person to come forward with DDT poisoning from the poisoning of the Santa Monica Bay. I think times today are much different because today, as I was reporting for Raising Healthy Kids, my new book, and I went from town to town, there are people all over this country now suffering. I am going to New York, for example, to visit Hoosick Falls, which is in one of the chapters in my book. That's because that town has had forever chemicals in its drinking water. They were one of the first towns to discover these are chemicals that are used in stain-resistant clothing. In this case, the town in Hoosick Falls was given a really fat contract to make those tents for the Hajj. That's the religious journey um, in the Islamic faith, where folks go to Mecca this time of year.
Okay.
And this town got a contract to make waterproof and stain resistant and fire resistant tents out of these really toxic chemicals that poison their water. So they were making money and poisoning themselves. So I went to Hoosick Falls, and then I went to like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where a family had been taking their kids to daycare, and they never bothered to test the water at their daycare center. It also had these forever chemicals, and their kids were poisoned. And this was happening I went to Cape Fear in North Carolina, and across the nation. And there were other issues too. I met, for example, in New York City, interestingly, this was a very positive story in a way. During the pandemic, there was a baby boom among hairdressers. And the reason there was a baby boom is that because they had all stopped working and they weren't being exposed to these really toxic chemicals in their cosmetic and personal care and hairstyling products. So all of a sudden, all these hairdressers who are all women could have babies again because they weren't being exposed to chemicals like quaternium compounds, for example, or triclosan and other disinfectants that can harm reproductive capacity. So times were very dark in the 80s because we didn't have information. This is actually a time of light because we have so much information. We know we're all victims now. I'm talking to you about things I never would have talked to anyone about. We wouldn't have been able to have the conversation when I began this work. So no, it's not a time of darkness, it's a time of light. But what do we do with this knowledge? How do we get empowered and make the choices that are safe for our own family, but that also promote healthy communities throughout the country? Because we really need it now.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how everything has a dark side and a light side? Speaking of the internet and that bringing all the knowledge to us and connecting us so that we're able to find these things out. But at the same time, I think you and I both know that the internet isn't necessarily good for our health when we're talking about blue light exposure, some of the different things that we're exposed to on the internet without our consent a lot of the time, and things of that nature. So how do you address that?
Well, I actually discuss in my new book, Raising Healthy Kids, the negative effects of the internet. For example, overuse of smartphones, and when kids put them, oh, I hate it when my kids do this, when they put them in their pocket,
Mhm.
sons and daughters, but my sons put them in their jean pocket right next to their genitalia. Studies do show that the boys who use those cell phones the most have the lowest levels of sperm. Their sperm counts go down. They've also been associated with various types of cancer. So there, and the social impact of making kids feel crummy about themselves is huge. I
Mhm.
know, yeah, and so what I'm talking about though is that we've set up social networks now among toxic poisoning victims that have just let everyone talk to each other, and I think that's the positive side. One person I wrote about, her name is Stephanie Marrow, and she's actually a stylist in Orlando, Florida, and she had a really bad experience with Diva Curl hair care products, which are for curly haired people. And her clients were getting sick, they were losing their hair, and Diva Curl didn't seem to really care or want to do much or discuss it. And I detail this in my book. She put together a Facebook group that now has like 60,000 members. And these are men and women who can share their experience with Diva Curl. In fact, there was a successful class action because people were able to talk. Um, I think the Diva Curl products, when I've looked at them, I did this for Not So Pretty, a documentary on HBO. It's on there now. And I looked at the Diva Curl products, and I think they really overload them with a very dangerous chemical called quaternium compounds. That can, and I write about this in Raising Healthy Kids, they can actually make it difficult, if not impossible, for couples to have babies when they're overused in our life, as they are right now. So I know the internet has the dark side, and particularly both physiologically and psychologically, but for what I've been doing in the anti-toxic movement and what we're trying to do, all of us, it's like, yeah, now we know that we're not crazy. I'm not crazy for being concerned about DDT, or I'm not crazy because um, my kids are acting out when they get foods with red dye number 40. Other parents are having this problem. And you know what? There's a book called About ADHD that lists food dyes as an aggravator of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So yeah, there's a dark side, but the positive side is we victims know that we're not alone anymore, and that stopping the isolation is going to lead to accountability for a lot of companies that have been getting away with putting poisons into our food, water, and air.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. It actually, a metaphor came to mind that I'm sure you've heard of before, where a knife could be a weapon or it could be a tool. You could use it during surgery to save someone's life, or you could use it to kill someone. So I feel like with the internet, we have it as what it is, and we can learn to use it for good, or we can lean into the shadow side of it. But ultimately there is a lot of positivity that can come from it, and it's how we choose to use it and what we choose to do with that information.
Yeah, although mom and dad, if you're listening right now, don't let your kids sleep with the phone next to their head. Take it
Right.
away, tell them to turn it off, okay? That ain't safe. It ain't safe for them psychologically, and it ain't safe for them health-wise.
Yes, we definitely got to pay attention to the radiation. I want to talk about your book, Raising Healthy Kids. What are some of the most surprising or alarming findings that you discovered during your research for this book?
I think the most alarming finding is just how pervasive our exposures can be, and that low levels that we're all being exposed to are not only altering our kids now, but future generations. And our exposures to chemical toxins are putting our nation at risk, our future. And I'll explain this and what I mean. When I began the book, I was looking at, well, how do chemicals affect individual kids? Like, it will increase their risk for cancer, for example. If my child eats a lot of, say, hot dogs with nitrite in them, will that increase their risk for, yes, it will, mom and dad. Don't get hot dogs with nitrite. Get the turkey dogs, try to get them with the celery seed extract, which is a bit safer, or get, what I do with my kids is get them tofu hot dogs and organic baked beans or organic hot dog buns. They don't know the difference. I just slip in those tofu hot dogs and they're fun with a little mustard or relish. And the mustard and relish are organic, and there's a reason why. The most alarming finding, though, and the one I'm trying to talk about for everyone to understand, particularly politicos, is, a lot of things are happening now in society where states are enacting anti-transgender laws, for example. You can't use this bathroom if you were assigned this at birth, or um, there's no chance that if you're trans, you'll compete on a sports team. It's just out of the question. Things like that are happening. Um, people, uh, there's ADHD is increasing. Those are things on an individual level. But what's going on societally is this. The nation is not able to reproduce to sustain its population. Our democracy is at risk for authoritarianism. Gender fluidity uh, is increasing. The prevalence of trans kids, LGBTQ plus kids is increasing. Some of these things are, I'm not talking about them morally right now. I'm just trying to point out a few things. Kids' anatomy is changing. But these just aren't superficial changes. They're affecting society. For example, if we wonder why societal dysfunction seems to be on the increase, we are dumbing down our population on an entire basis now with nanoplastic particles and other exposures. One study in Salinas, California, and I would love to come back to this town with what we're talking about, showed that kids who were exposed to pesticides, because their mothers were exposed, their mothers had high levels in their urine when they were measured. These kids lost up to 7 points in IQ. The same study, another study in New York, far away from farm fields in Salinas, in New York, in an urban center, showed that when mom had high levels of the organophosphate pesticides, just like in Salinas, but in New York now, these kids also lost up to 7 points, and they were also at risk for ADHD and other behavioral disorders. Now, in Salinas, when these kids were examined, these kids growing up with moms who had high pesticide levels, the doctor studying them, this was done at UC Berkeley, discovered that portions of their brain were dead matter. They just didn't, there were portions of the brain where you want to be able to think and have that capacity, executive management capacity, the ability to think through different ideas. They didn't have that brain power because it was gone. It had never developed. This was measured through MRIs, through actual scans. These are not exceptional exposures. These are just high normal exposures to our kids. We're doing this across a society because it's not just limited to Salinas or New York. You know, if 1 or 2% of a population becomes a little dumber or becomes a little more dysfunctional in integrating into society, that can make a huge difference in a nation. Just 1 or 2%. It's a huge impact. I mean, elections are decided by less than 1%. But studies have shown that as you decrease people's IQ, they become more enamored of autocracy and authoritarianism. They also become more prejudiced or superstitious. So what we're essentially doing is creating a politic not based on politics itself, but based on intelligence. And if you wonder why the Republican Party has morphed, for example, and I'm trying not to be political here, but trying to just observe these things. But if you wonder why one party has morphed into one that seems more authoritarian oriented, you can start looking at a neurobiological basis for what's happening in this country. Similarly, and then we'll put this all together, the rate of gender fluidity is increasing in the United States. And now transgender has always, kids and adults, that's always been with us. It's always been with us since time immemorial. It's a natural variation. But what we've been doing with chemicals that cause endocrine disruption, that means they interfere with the body's sex hormones. And these are chemicals that are commonly found in cosmetics and personal care products like phthalates, for example, or those forever chemicals I mentioned that were in the drinking water of Portsmouth, for the family in Portsmouth or in Hoosick Falls. Well, these chemicals all interfere with the sex hormones. So when you start doing that to an entire population, you're going to increase the variations, the chances of variations. So it's affecting everyone. Some kids may now identify very strongly as transgender. Some kids may just not have a strong polarity towards masculine or feminine. And on the gender scale, not a thing where it's male or female, but the scale where you tend to be more like a mosaic, more of this or less of that. More kids are not just identifying as strictly male or female. They're becoming more gender fluid in the way they gender identify. And when you look at why these things are happening, you can go to the neurobiology of our society. Just to explain it in layperson's terms, the body's two biggest sex organs are the genitalia and the brain. But they develop at different times during pregnancy. So if during pregnancy, the genitalia develop early on, but later during the pregnancy, say mom is going out for the night. Let's just say mom is going out to a fancy function. Or let's say mom is using a lot of perfume for a while, or she's using a particular product that has lots of phthalate and never disclosed it. And I share how to find safe products in Raising Healthy Kids. So I'm not trying to disempower, I'm just trying to share the story. She starts using these products while the child's brain is developing, which is at a different time than the genitalia. It only takes fake estrogens or xenoestrogens in the parts per trillion level to change the terrain of the brain so that it won't necessarily develop in a masculine way. It may develop in a more feminine way, whereas the genitalia are developing in a more masculine way. So you get a disparity between the genitalia and the brain, but they're both dependent on the sex hormones to develop either towards the male or female. But if you start interfering with these things, then the way kids gender identify is going to be altered too. So we will have more kids who identify as trans or gender fluid. And so if you try to And so society is now trying to put a Band-Aid on internal wounds or internal things happening. Society, North Carolina had that anti-trans ban a few years ago, with bathrooms. And this is going on, there are hundreds of anti-transgender pieces of legislation throughout the country. And, society is trying to, I'll put this in quotes, correct a behavior that is natural, number one. Two, is not immoral. Three, is just part of the human experience. But you can't just tell someone you have to identify this way when their whole brain is wired to identify as male, or say they're a male, but they identify as female, and their brain is wired that way. You can't just all of a sudden tell them, no, you can't be this. And also, these laws, in my opinion, don't make sense because I've tried to explain the biology of it. You know, gender identity is not just determined by the genitalia. Folks who are passing these laws may want to think that way, but that's old science. Gender identity comes from the brain.
Interesting. So you believe that if a 6 or 7-year-old child is born a girl but thinks that she's a boy, that she should have a sex change?
No, not at 6 or 7. No, no, no.
What age do you think that's appropriate to make that decision?
Oh, well, I'm not a physician on, where I can comment on what age a child should or shouldn't, and whether a child should or shouldn't. In Raising Healthy Kids, we talk about, is this the way your child identifies, or is this an episode where they're just expressing themselves? So, I'm not
What's your-
advocating for sex, for surgeries, for hormones. I'm not advocating for that really, for that use. That's a parent and child and doctor decision they have to come to terms with. But what I am saying is that parents may be, and I talk about this, your child may, when they're 6 or 7 or 8, identify in a certain way, and a parent may really freak out. They may start all of a sudden saying, well, you can't paint your fingernails, right? I tell a story about that. For example, one person who I write about in Raising Healthy Kids, her mom was given the drug DES, diethylstilbestrol, during their pregnancy, and DES was the first endocrine disruptor. And many of the kids born from moms who were given DES have either experienced cancer or gender dysphoria. And this particular person, Dr. Dana Bear, used to get in trouble as a child for wanting to paint their fingernails. And instead of being supported by their parents, they were pretty much ostracized and say, if you behave this way, we're going to send you to the local insane asylum. They gave me the name of the place, the local mental institute facility, because you're just not right. Parents, no matter what you think, parents can't treat their kids like that. That's not going to help the situation. So in Raising Healthy Kids, I talk about, you're going to learn from your kids. Our kids today are not the same as us. For example, my parents, Jessica, were born before the World War II, before the petrochemical revolution. Their genetics were not altered by all these petrochemicals that came after World War II. So I inherited a distinctly different set of genes. My genes, as I mentioned, being a DDT victim, which is also an endocrine disruptor, my genes are very different than my parents, how they've been modified. Our kids' genes are completely severed now from a past where there were no petrochemicals. So kids born in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, their genes have been modified. They're very different in the way they express themselves hormonally than mine, and even my parents and grandparents. Our kids are not the same. Many of the boys don't have as much testosterone. This has been well documented. So I'm not really advocating, I'm really trying to educate and explain, mom and dad, if your child is coming out and saying, well, I feel this, or I feel more masculine and she's a girl, or yeah, I write about that too. Instead of ostracizing them or trying to put them in a straitjacket, you've got to just learn from them, have compassion, love is first, and let them educate you. What you can't do, no matter what you want the outcome to be, is put them in a straitjacket and say, you must not do this or that. Try to understand them. And then whatever happens after that, the results will be much stronger and much more compassionate. What I'm trying to say, though, is neurobiologically, the most alarming changes I'm seeing are very deep within society and are changing us, by 1 or 2%, changing the variations in society, and maybe more than 1 or 2% in some cases. And I think that's very shocking and something that regulators should be aware of. For just to go on with this, studies have found now that boys with the highest amounts of nanoplastics in their bodies also have low amounts of testosterone. Boys born to moms with high phthalates in their systems have lower amounts of sperm or testosterone. So what I'm saying is some of the most alarming findings go from the individual to society and what's happening in our society, and trying to understand that.
Let's talk about where those nanoplastics come from.
Well, everything seems to be packaged in plastic now, including our water. And they migrate from every plastic thing we buy. That's why one of the shopping lessons in raising healthy kids is to try to get as many of your goods, foods, particularly in cosmetics, foods, particularly in glass. Like, Jessica, like, for example, you want to buy mayonnaise, right?
Never.
Well, okay. But
Okay.
say you do. It all comes in plastic now. It used to come in these glass jars that were much safer, but you keep squeezing this plastic and it sloughs off into the product. Dust is the dust in our homes. Dust is like the Trojan horse of toxic poisoning. Dust contains tons of nanoplastics because it's the repository of everything we bring into our home. And then
Sorry to interrupt. I remember learning that dust is 90% skin, dead skin.
Well, I don't know all the exact percentages, but what I've read is that dust is a source of these forever chemicals, of nanoplastics. And our kids breathe it in, especially our toddlers who are on the floor. So, in raising healthy kids, I talk about why it's important to have a high efficiency particulate air filter or another type of effective air filter in your home, and to dust. And then when you dust, use safe cleaning products. And I talk about which brands are safe and how to find them, and so on. But dust is another source of nanoplastics. Our cosmetics and personal care products are an important source. Just a lot of companies, you'll see, for example, products with fragrance. When you see products that can list fragrance, they invariably will have phthalates, which are also nanoplastics, which are used to hold in the fragrance in the product. So, and these won't be disclosed on the label. And I run a nonprofit group, Healthy Living Foundation, and we'd been testing baby products, and we found a number of baby products had phthalates in them. They weren't disclosed. We've since sued these companies successfully to get them to stop using them. And I share the stories in Raising Healthy Kids. But our cosmetics can be a source of phthalates. So but instead of disempowering, while I'm saying this, in the same breath, I want mom and dad and kids to know. And this is also just as if you're an individual, just taking care of your own health. You can get safe cosmetics, and you can vastly reduce your exposure to these nanoplastics. And I share, for example, one key is to look for organic ingredients in your cosmetic and personal care products as well. these will invariably reduce your exposure. But also everything we use on a daily basis, like say you're in your car and your hands are on your steering wheel. Well, a lot of people have leather over their steering wheel. They have a little casing or cover over their steering wheel, but those things will have phthalates in them too. So every time you put your hands on the steering wheel cover, you're absorbing the phthalates. They do move through the skin into the system. So they're
Mhm.
very ubiquitous, and that's alarming too. And we're not, it's important for folks to realize you're not going to be perfect because of the pervasive nature of what I'm talking about. Don't expect perfection, but you can get big reductions in exposure, and your body will notice it immediately and respond with a healthy response, because the body responds immediately to its environment. And you can remodify those genes. If your kids, for example, are eating foods with endocrine disruptors in them from because they're not on an organic diet. The genes, the messenger RNA in your body picks up that there are fake estrogens in the body, and it gets influenced by these, and these fake estrogens occupy the cell receptors on your child's brain or their sex organs. Then they speak to the messenger RNA. The messenger RNA says, oh, these are toxic. This is toxic. But it doesn't care. It just says this is toxic, and it reprograms the DNA. So instead of producing a benign form of estrogen or more testosterone, the kid's body ends up producing toxic forms of estrogen, like it's called estradiol. There are various types of estrogen. One of the most toxic forms is estradiol. Or the body produces metabolites of estradiol that are long-lasting, carcinogenic, and stay on those cell receptors for a long time and are like a virus in the body. But if you take those out, then the body, and you start putting in, and the body doesn't have to compete because you're eating organic foods, suddenly the cell receptors may not have as many toxic fake estrogens occupying them. There'll be room for the body's natural hormones. And now the messenger RNA will say, oh, this is a much more less toxic form of estrogen. It's estriol, which is a very short lasting form, or a
Mhm.
metabolite of estriol, which is very short lasting. So now the body's genes will start producing less toxic forms of estrogen that do their job and dissipate and go away. So, the source of these nanoplastics and endocrine disruptors can be pervasive. We're not going to be perfect, but we can get vast reductions. And, as I was mentioning, different sources, one of the antidotes is an organic diet, and to seek organic ingredients in your cosmetic and personal care products.
It sounds like organic is critical, but what if someone is eating a standard American diet and they say that they can't afford organic?
Well, that's sad, number one. And two, that's one of the myths I've busted, and I want to bust it completely. Organics are not necessarily more expensive any longer. And this is a really positive story. When we mentioned the 1980s and 1990s, when I wrote Diet for a Poison Planet, there was no organic market in 1990, Jessica. There were no organic foods. The best you could do is ask the farmer, or you could go into a supermarket and the supermarket would say, well, we've tested our produce for these 5 chemicals, which was better than nothing, but it certainly wasn't organic. The reason why an organic market exists is because of the power of you and me. Because we started demanding healthier foods as we learned about the harm coming to communities, to farm workers, our own children. Consumers began demanding organic foods. Initially in the late 90s, when organics began to blossom, everything was more expensive because the market was so small, demand so huge. The demand has only grown, but so has the market. This did not happen, and the supply is also growing. This did not happen because of uh, a top down, because the government ordained, we're going to have organic foods now. this happened because of consumers like you and me who were buying those organic strawberries when they really were a lot more expensive, like $7, $8. Although with inflation now, $7 or $8 sounds like, oh, that's today. But back then, $7 or $8 for a pint of strawberries was expensive. And they were organic, and people would say, why are you buying these? And then they'd say, well, organic doesn't make any difference to your health. Studies weren't in then. They could say that because we haven't even done the published peer-reviewed studies. But because of our demand and the increasing supply, you can now buy organic foods, especially the staples like celery, lettuce, potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, bread, apples. You can buy all these at about the same price, if not less expensive than conventionally grown crops. So that's the first myth to bust. Organic is not necessarily more expensive. Plus, we were talking about the virtues of the internet. Well, it's great for bargain shopping. If I want organic food now, I can go to Instacart, one of the online shopping services, put in organic foods and see who's got those russet potatoes on sale for, $3.99 for 5 pounds, or who's got the best deal on organic carrots. And I can shop around. So I give a lot of tips in raising healthy kids. Another example from my book, you can, or what are called the glamour fruits, like berries, blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, tend to have a lot of fungicide sprayed on them because they're so fragile. And I give farmers a lot of credit, organic especially, because being a gardener myself and trying to grow my own foods. Oh, I see all those beautiful strawberries one night, and the next morning they're like all eaten away from the meal bugs. And raising organic food is not easy. So give your farmer real credit there. But you can, instead of, they can still be expensive when they're fresh. But you know what? You can go to Smart and Final or uh Walmart or some of the other stores and get a 2 or 3 pound bag of organic berries, mixed blueberries, strawberries together, or just strawberries, for about the same price as conventionally sourced fresh. And when I'm talking to parents, I say, kids love these frozen fruits and they're organic. And mom and dad, if you bought like some non-fat organic yogurt, or even just non-fat yogurt, maybe some uh, organic walnuts or almonds, and you use these as your kids' dessert instead of ice cream. Full-fat ice cream will have a lot of pesticides because some of the worst pesticides accumulate in the fatty tissues of animals, like DDT. But if you get the non-fat yogurt, these fresh frozen organic berries, some organic nuts, this is all about the same price, if not cheaper, than a conventionally sourced dessert or snack. So much healthier for your kids, same price. Kids' bodies will respond right away. Healthier, better behavior. This is documented. This is not, I'm a parent, so I see it in my own kids and other kids. But we do know that kids on organic diets have less obesity, less diabetes, fewer lower cancer incidents. Mom, if she's pregnant, will have fewer complications during her pregnancy when on an organic diet. Dad will have a higher sperm count. All documented, peer-reviewed, published studies show this. So, it isn't more expensive, and the benefits are really big. So, and then you're also making a huge change. So that's one myth. Organics are not more expensive. That's a big one to bust through.
Getting a little nuanced for a moment, you mentioned being able to buy organics from places like Walmart. I know Costco has organic produce as well, and I don't trust it. From my own personal experience, just doing my own experiments on myself with different stores and their organic offerings. And then also, I actually saw a video recently where someone got apples that were organic from Walmart, and with the peel peeled off of it, left it outside for 2 weeks, and no bugs attacked it, and not even browned or anything. it's supposed to be organic. And yeah, so it's just, I don't know, when it comes to the food, it's like you kind of have to use your own discernment and really be in tune with your body a lot of the times, and also trust where you're getting it from, because I don't know what the laws or the limitations are now when it comes to conventional versus organic. I feel like there's a blurry line. I feel like there's a lot of money involved. I think things are still sprayed, and maybe, in the wind carries some of the spray over to the organics. I don't know, but there's something going on there. Would you agree?
Well, here's my position. Organics are not perfect. In fact, we've sued a few through my Healthy Living Foundation. We've sued a few companies offering organic products for high amounts of lead. So I'm quite aware that organics are not perfect, but let's not let the good be the enemy of the uh, perfect. In other words, I've looked at monitoring studies for organic foods compared to conventionally sourced. These are studies that check them to see if they do have pesticides. Organic foods are so much lower in pesticide residue overall that, you may buy a brand, like you said, maybe it's uh, a ripoff, maybe it's fake, but overall, the organic market is for real. Overall, organic foods, and this has been shown in published peer-reviewed studies, will vastly and significantly reduce your or your child's exposure to pesticides. There was a study done, for example, in Washington State, where the researchers substituted organic foods for conventionally sourced foods in kids' diets for a few weeks. They measured their levels of organophosphate pesticides before and after the switch in their urine. And the levels went way down to non-detectable after switching the kids to organic foods. So no one should make the claim that organics are perfect. We've got real problems now with Roundup, for example, that herbicide that seems to be showing up in many foods, and it is, and it needs to be better regulated, if not completely banned. But that aside, nonetheless, organic foods are still your best choice for significantly reducing your exposure to chemical toxins and gaining the benefits. And not only that, when you buy organic foods, you're impacting communities. And I'll just go back to Salinas to give you an example. In my reporting, I've often traveled to Salinas. It's a small town in California that is said to be the nation's salad bowl. And that's because 70% of the nation's lettuce is produced in Salinas, as well as strawberries and other crops. The last time I went to Salinas, just a couple years ago during the pandemic, I went to these schools. When I used to go to these schools, they were surrounded by agricultural fields that were being sprayed with organophosphate pesticides, like diazinon and chlorpyrifos. And the schoolyard, play yards were right next to the fields. The only thing separating the sprayed field from the schoolyard was a chain link fence. That's it. These schools are literally in Salinas and the area, Monterey County, carved right into the farm fields. And the last time I went there, and I went back to these schools, they were all surrounded by organic strawberry and lettuce fields. And I even took pictures and I published stories about it. I called a friend of mine, Oscar Ramos, who was teaching at the time in Salinas. And I said, Oscar, what's going on here? And he said, well, David, it's because of folks like you buying all those organic strawberries and all that organic lettuce that led the farmers here. There is so much demand that they're planting more and more organics, and they're planting them right around the schools. So now when the kids go to school, instead of breathing in pesticides, they're not. They're surrounded by lettuce and strawberries that they can eat right off the plants because they're not being sprayed at all. To me, Jessica, it was like a miracle of faith, because I mentioned that when I began all this, and I was buying, for example, strawberries, people would say, you know, why are you spending so much on organic strawberries? You know, and again, they'd say, well, you know, it doesn't make any difference, but it does. And I saw it. All those organic strawberries that I've been buying, you've been buying, that all of us have been buying. That's why in Salinas, California, and Salinas isn't the only community. Those schools are now surrounded by organic lettuce and strawberry fields. So our shopping choices can have a profound impact, not only on our health, but on the health of communities across the nation. So I'll share another story with you. This one, how we can make a difference. And why it's important, you know, we can get discouraged. There's a lot of, look, there's a lot of money and corruption in the world. Even the good people, the people that we admire, sometimes we have to see them as fallen. You know, and but we can't let that disempower us or disincentivize us, because what I'm talking about really makes a difference. Here's another couple examples. East Palestine, Ohio. In February 2023, there was a terrible train derailment there. And I was trains carrying chemical tanker cars. And authorities, after the derailment, authorities released polyvinyl chloride, a carcinogen, into the town's air. And people now are suffering. I looked at the ambient monitoring reports. So many chemicals were released into their environment. People there are suffering now. When you go shopping, mom and dad, next time, this is good for you and good for your kids. Say you're going to buy your kids backpacks to go back to school with. You know, a lot of backpacks advertise that they are made with polyvinyl chloride, which is a carcinogen. And we talked about, and by the way, when there's polyvinyl chloride in a product, there are also nanoplastics. They go together. Phthalates and polyvinyl chloride go together. So when you're buying your kids back to school backpacks, for example, or maybe you're buying bibs for your baby, many of them will list right on there on Amazon or wherever you shop that they contain polyvinyl chloride. They almost say it proudly as if this is a good thing. You can avoid these products. And you know what? And for example, if you were buying a shower curtain, you can buy shower curtains that are either made from organic cotton or from um, plastics, but they're not as toxic as polyvinyl chloride. You can find these very easily now. But the point is the folks in East Palestine didn't need to go through this. And we don't need to pile on as a society. There's going to be another train derailment. It doesn't need to be one with polyvinyl chloride. The way to stop this is for you, mom and dad, for me, for all of us to be more aware of what we're buying when we're shopping. Most of the time, Jessica, when we buy items like lunch boxes, we really don't know what's in them. And as consumers, we not only have a right, we now have an obligation to know what's in them, because it makes a difference, not only in our lives, but in the lives of communities across America. And I believe we have much more in common with our neighbors, no matter where they are politically. We have much more in common than we do than the differences. And one of the things we have in common is we all care about our kids and our communities. And no matter whether we are right or left, blue or red, we can all agree, except unless you're being corrupted. And I can share with you by money from the chemical companies. We can all agree that these chemicals are not good for our kids or our society. So we can be better neighbors for East Palestine or Salinas simply with our shopping choices. It helps us, but it also helps our neighbors.
I have one final question for you, David, but before I ask it, where do you want to send the listeners?
Well, to get a copy of Raising Healthy Kids, Protecting Your Children from Hidden Chemical Toxins, you can buy it from your local independent bookseller. You can get it from your Barnes and Noble, or you can go online to Amazon and just put in Raising Healthy Kids in my name, David Steinman, and get a copy. And that has everything in it. It has my experience as a dad. to my children and how I've dealt with the cosmetic issue with my teen daughter, or the cologne issue with my teen sons. How to buy organic foods. I'm an activist, so I'm on a budget. I know what it's like, how to do things on a budget, how to find your safe cleaning products, the questions to ask before you send your kids off to school that first day, what you need to know about the school. There's a chapter on deep caring. How do you be a good role model for your kids? Stories from across the country from activist parents who want us to learn and empower us. So it's really like a black belt course in protecting yourself and your family from chemical toxins. You may think this is to protect my family, but you know what, mom and dad, or if you're single, if you do what's in the book for yourself, you're going to be so much healthier for your kids. So yeah, independent booksellers, Barnes and Noble, or Amazon.
Yeah, that was one of the things I wanted to point out, is that it might be called Raising Healthy Kids, but from the looks of it, I think that everyone could use this information. And I'm so grateful for authors like you to write things like these books like these, because I have so many nieces and nephews, and this is just something that, the world needs. And I can see that clearly in all kinds of different parenting, via the wonderful internet. And this book is definitely needed in this day and age. So thank you for bringing light to all of the darkness that, once we become aware of, it is not so dark, and we can learn how to navigate that. So thank you, David. And my last question for you today is, what is your number one health tip? So whether that is diet, mindset, emotional, physical, just the one piece of advice that you would like everyone to know.
Oh, that's okay. I'm gonna give two: organics and exercise. Organics and exercise. I really think getting out in the sun and exercising is real important for our kids. You've got to feel your body. You've got to feel your body. And then if you feel your body, then put some good organic foods into it. Yeah, it's a double win. Organics is really a frame of mind. It's not just a term. People who buy organic foods are thinking about their health and what they're buying. But don't forget, you have your body and you need to exercise it. Get out there and run and jump with your kids and enjoy the outdoors. Get on some real grass. Don't do the fake artificial stuff. If you're gonna enjoy your body, get out there on some real grass and enjoy the sunshine this summer.
Mhm. Beautifully said. I agree. Thank you so much, David. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to seeing more work that you do, more books that you write.
Thanks, Jessica. It's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Enjoy your travels.